All right, welcome back, folks. We have another AE 9/11 Truth update, and it's regarding the struggle to get this paper written by Tony Szamboti and Richard Johns published through the ASCE. And of course, the ramifications, if we succeed, are going to be huge because, of course, NIST bases its whole theory of what happened to the Twin Towers off of what Zdeněk Bažant wrote, and that paper is refuting it. So let's go ahead and bring in our Director of Strategy and Development, who's been working closely with those two gentlemen on this. He's going to be telling you all of the newest updates. Ted, welcome back.
Thanks, Andy. How you doing?
I'm good, and I'm watching this very closely because it's one of those things that it's not on the front page of the New York Times. Hardly anything we do is, but it's going on behind the scenes. And as I was saying before I brought you on, the ramifications, if we succeed, will be huge for furthering our mission. So there may be new supporters watching, people who are always learning about us and new to the whole AE sphere. So bring them up to date on what we're talking about. And by that, I mean everything leading up to the new development.
Sure. So NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is the federal agency that was tasked with investigating the collapse of the World Trade Center towers on 9/11. And as many of our listeners know, NIST did not actually analyze how the towers came down once the collapses initiated. There's no analysis to explain how the top of each tower crushed the structure below it. They basically left that analysis to an engineering professor, as you mentioned, by the name of Zdeněk Bažant, who works at Northwestern University, who submitted a paper just days after 9/11 and then later had it published in January 2002 that attempts to explain how that could happen. How could the tops actually crush the 90 stories below them at almost free fall acceleration? For many years, researchers, engineers, and so on, those were very influential papers that he published, that first one, and then a few in later years. And people started to study those papers and realize that there were serious flaws with them. And one of the biggest issues, when you look at it closely, when you look at the video footage, and this was first really explored in a paper by an engineer named Tony Szamboti, who we're talking about here, who we're working with, is that the top of the tower, when it starts to come down, and we're focusing on the North Tower, never actually slows down. When you measure it, when you measure the acceleration carefully. Bazant published a paper then in 2011 that tried to explain why you don't see a deceleration. His paper tries to say that the deceleration is there because there has to be one because you have two structures hitting, but it's so small that a video camera wouldn't be able to capture that deceleration. Szamboti and his co-author, Richard Johns, read Bazant's latest paper. This was the final paper that he's published. This was in 2011, saw that he had, again, the same fundamental errors, many of the same fundamental errors in that paper. Basically, these his input values, the numbers that he was putting into his analysis, his equations and so on, were the wrong numbers. And it was leading to the opposite result of what you would get if you put in the right numbers. Basically, using his same analysis, when you correct the numbers, you can show that the top would actually have slowed down considerably, and you would be able to measure that deceleration, even as it's captured in a video camera. So where are we today? Basically, they submitted a paper trying to refute his analysis because they realized there were those errors. And for 10 years or so, the ASCE journal, the Journal of Engineering Mechanics, has prevented Tony and Richard Johns' paper from being published. And they've given all sorts of excuses, the most blatantly outrageous excuse being that their paper, which is critiquing Bazant's paper, is somehow out of scope for the journal. And so we were fighting that for the last 3.5 years. We were fighting that out of scope decision. This happened back in 2013. Finally, it took them 27 months to get the out of scope decision. And then there were several years in between where we were trying to figure out what to do. And then we realized that we could file this ethics complaint, filed an ethics complaint saying that the out of scope rejection was not fair, was unethical, was against the ASCE's publication policies, and so on. And finally, 3.5 years later, we got the new editor of the Journal of Engineering Mechanics to agree to a new review, which was the goal of the ethics complaint all along. We weren't trying to punish the editors back in 2013. We were just trying to get the paper published. So this new editor finally agrees to a new review of the paper. And we're all very excited about that. Although we realize there's also a risk there. Is he going to review this paper fairly? And unfortunately, a few weeks after this, we learn about this good news. We get the decision from the editor, and he's rejecting the paper. Sadly, on pretty much this equally outrageous grounds as the out of scope rejection back in 2013. So, and I could go into some detail about what that rejection is. The news today is that Tony and Richard Johns have submitted an appeal finally of the rejection in May. And there's a twist here. When we first received the rejection, he doesn't actually explain his reasons. He basically says, I agree with the original reviewer back in 2011 on scientific grounds, but he doesn't explain why. And Tony and Richard back in 2012 submitted a rebuttal of the reviewer's comments, right? And so the new editor is supposed to look at their rebuttal and look at the reviewer's comments and figure out who's right here. He doesn't do any of that. He doesn't explain why he agrees with the reviewer. He just says, I agree with the reviewer on scientific grounds. Basically and we know because he can't actually, the reviewer's arguments are wrong. And Tony and Richard in their rebuttal thoroughly debunk the reviewer's claims. But this editor now says, oh, I just agree with the original review. He doesn't explain why. And so now we at first tried to say, this is not in accordance with the process that was laid out as the resolution to our ethics complaint. We're not gonna dance here. Like he's not being fair. Like we're not gonna treat this like a fair review and actually appeal it. We object to the whole process and we want it to start over. We want him to do a new review where he actually explains why he agrees with the original reviewer. The folks at the ASCE basically told us the way to handle this is to appeal his decision. Don't try to get him to do a new review. Just appeal his decision. So now Richard and Tony have submitted, as of today, submitted an appeal, but they've also said if you still stand by your position and you give us a technically reasoned decision for why you stand by why you agree with this reviewer, we will still have another opportunity to appeal because your first review was not a real technical review. And so we shouldn't be forced to waste our appeal opportunity responding to your review that wasn't a real review. So that's sort of where we are today. I think I'm actually pretty optimistic at this point, weirdly, given everything that we've gone through. But I think that we've really boxed in this editor. His name is Franz-Josef, by the way. I think we've boxed him in, and there will be a lot of pressure on him by the other folks at the ASCE to actually do the right thing and fairly review this article. And there's no way for him to fairly review it and not publish it.
Yeah, well, let's get into some of the meat of the letter here, because they wrote in it, quote, your decision was not a, quote, technically reasoned decision because you did not explain why you concurred on scientific grounds with the arguments of the reviewer, despite our rebuttal of the reviewer's comments, which you did not address at all in your decision. So you sort of addressed this a little, but I just want to strip it down here. I mean, on what basis did they even try to justify their decision? My understanding of the real world and how it works is even if somebody is trying to snow you over, they have to try to come up with some kind of explanation, even if it's bad. So did they try to justify this at all?
Essentially, no. Only in the most transparently ridiculous way. And by the way, we're going to publish there. You can read in this article. You can read Tony and Richard's appeal to the editor, so you'll be able to see his letter, the relevant part of his letter. And no, he makes some really ridiculous claims. He first refers to the wrong paper. He refers to Bazant's 2008 paper instead of Bazant's 2011 paper, which is kind of a giveaway that this was a pretty sloppy review. He then tries to say that Tony and Richard are not really discussing the essence of his paper. They're just focused on his assumptions. And so they're not really contributing in any significant way to our understanding of structural mechanics. And that's not what this, I mean, they accept Bazant's methodology, Bazant and Lay's methodology. But the problem with their paper is in the actual details, is in the input values. He's trying to say that somehow that's not questioning their input values is like not a legitimate form of is not the kind of paper that should be published in the journal, when actually journal editors have a responsibility if there's errors in the literature in the papers that they publish to actually go back and correct it. So that line of reasoning makes no sense. But then he basically goes on to say, I read the old reviewers' comments and I agree with those, and my understanding, and this is another giveaway that he didn't really carefully review this. He says, my understanding is that there was no significant changes to the new manuscript, to the revised manuscript from the first one that Tony and Richard submitted. So the issues of the original reviewer that the original reviewer pointed out still stand. Richard and Tony thoroughly, in my view, refuted the original reviewer's comments, and the editor now, it doesn't mention their rebuttal of the reviewer's comments whatsoever in his decision. He just says, I agree with the reviewer's comments on scientific grounds, and doesn't explain why. So I was pretty shocked to learn when I started asking around to people who publish in academic journals regularly, is this normal to get a decision from an editor where they don't really explain their position at all? They don't, and I was surprised to learn that, yeah, actually it's not that uncommon that editors will sometimes just be like, no, like, not good enough. That's it. Now, this is a unique situation. First of all, it's a discussion paper. We're not submitting an original paper for consideration in the journal. We're just commenting on a paper that was already published in the journal. It really should be up to the original authors to refute, to analyze and refute what Tony and Richard are saying, not the editor, right? So there should be like a clearer path to getting a discussion paper published. But secondly, the ethics complaint, what we said in the ethics complaint was, we will stop the ethics complaint if we can get a technical review where the paper is either published or the editor gives us a technically reasoned decision not to publish it. And this was not a technically reasoned decision because he didn't actually explain his technical reasoning. So it failed to satisfy what was sort of the remedy or the resolution to this ethics complaint. And so in this particular situation, even if it happens sometimes that editors don't explain themselves, in this instance, this editor really had to explain himself, and he didn't. And so that's what we objected to at first. We're saying we're not even going to participate in this if this is what he's going to do. But we were like, you know what? We'll just appeal it so that he's forced to respond. But we're also going to insist that we get another chance to appeal in case he comes back with something totally ridiculous that needs to be refuted.
Yeah, well, I'm not an engineer, but I did not realize that words like essence were thrown around in the scientific community. Usually when I hear that kind of word, I think of the arts. So just imagine trying to hand in a math problem where you say 2 + 2 = 5, and they say you're wrong. You say, well, no, but the essence of it is what I'm trying to get at here. You're just not seeing it four-dimensionally. But no, in science, you got to get things right. And so to me, the essence is they got things wrong. The conclusion was wrong. They also write in the paper, or in the letter rather, we discovered in the annual report to the EMI membership for FY 2013 that you were serving on the EMI Board of Governors in September of 2013, which is when the board reviewed and declined our appeal of the editors. Later, they write, would you please advise whether or not you participated in the review of our appeal to the EMI Board of Governors in September 2013? To be clear, we are not claiming that you have a conflict of interest in this matter. We are only seeking full transparency around the handling of our submission. So, Ted, explain to the folks out there what the EMI Board of Governors is and what's so important about this Ulm character serving on it.
Yeah, so the EMI Board of Governors is the Engineering Mechanics Institute Board of Governors, and that's one of several institutes that are under the ASCE that focus on a specific area of engineering, and they oversee the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. The Journal of Engineering Mechanics is sort of the flagship journal of the Engineering Mechanics Institute. So the Board of Governors, basically, at your last resort, if you have submitted a paper and it's been rejected, and then you appeal, and then it's rejected again, the last resort is to appeal to the Board of Governors of the EMI in this case. And so Richard and Tony back in 2013 appealed to the EMI Board of Governors when their paper, a discussion paper about Bazant's paper, was rejected by the journal as out of scope, which is obviously wrong and unethical. And the Board of Governors, the EMI Board of Governors in 2013, upheld the editor's decision. Although we realized, based on communications with members of the Board of Governors afterwards, that they didn't even know that the paper was rejected as out of scope. They thought, they were led to believe in their review that it was rejected on technical grounds. No, it was finally rejected as out of scope. Anyway, Ulm was serving on the Board of Governors, on the EMI Board of Governors at that time. So he was involved in the review of, if he was there, if he attended that meeting in September of 2013, he was involved in the review of Tony and Richard's appeal of the rejection of their paper. And so, does that present a conflict of interest? Well, he's essentially being asked right now to review and publish a paper that he was involved in upholding the rejection of 9 years ago. So, you can't say that he has a totally impartial, that he's in a totally impartial position here. Somebody who's totally impartial, who totally able to be totally objective, would be somebody who had no involvement whatsoever in the handling of this paper. And so what we say in the letter, essentially what they say in the letter is, we're not claiming you necessarily have a conflict of interest here, but we're giving you, if you would want to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest, we would not be opposed to reassigning this review to an associate editor at the journal. I think what's interesting is just how small this community is, and this niche community of engineering mechanics is, and it's sort of like they seem to have all bought into the official story of 9/11, of how the towers came down, or at least they appear to on the surface. They all seem to have bought into, or at least loyal to, Zdeněk Bažant, because he's sort of like the as far as I can tell from my layman's perspective, not being an engineer, not being involved in this world, is like the godfather of that world. And so like they're all, it's like, yeah, we might be hard to find somebody who's totally impartial, because they seem to have all drunk this Kool-Aid. Perhaps I haven't interacted with all of them, but so far everyone that we've dealt with, when we saw Ulm's response, we were hoping that he was just going to come to this with fresh eyes and be like, oh my God, these guys were treated wrongly. Of course, this paper should be published, and let's see how Bazant and Lay will respond to it. But no, we get the exact opposite of what we were hoping for in the most extreme version possible, like the most basically despicable way of rejecting this paper, which is to say, I disagree with it, but to not explain why he disagrees.
Yeah, pre-planted biases, I think, are probably clouding their regular process and their regular judgment on something like this. And, certainly it's a factor to pay attention to and bring to the attention of all the people involved. All right, so in the technical rebuttal section of this letter, which again we're going to be publishing in the article, so you out there can read it for yourselves if you want to. But in that technical rebuttal section, Szamboti and Johns make 4 points in response to that reviewer's claims. So briefly talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, they summarize the reviewer had many claims. This is the person who reviewed Richard and Tony's first submission, which happened back in 2011. A year later, in 2012, they got the rejection back, and it was based on this reviewer's comments. And so they submitted a rebuttal. And so in the letter that we're talking about now, in the present, they basically listed the 5 key claims by the reviewer. And then they explained within that why those, and this was very brief. You have to actually go into the rebuttal to really digest this and make sense of who's right and wrong. But even from reading the letter, you can tell, well, the reviewer says this, and in a sentence they explain, this was our response. This is how we showed the reviewer was wrong. The reviewer says this is how we showed the reviewer was wrong. So you can't help when you read the letter but see that Richard and Tony have a very compelling, rebuttals of what the reviewer said, and clearly, Ulm for some reason didn't really dive into looking at their rebuttal and trying to actually make sense of who's right and wrong here. So I mean, and we're talking about very, very technical issues when we get into what the reviewer is saying. But one relatively simple thing was The reviewers, saying that Bazant's estimate for the mass of the upper section is probably correct, and Tony and Richard are saying, no, it's not, and we provided the evidence that it's not correct. NIST uses the same value as us for the upper section, the same mass. Bazant and Lay don't provide any support for their estimate of the weight of the upper section. So that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. How could you possibly agree with Bazant and Lay on their estimate for the mass of the upper section when NIST and Tony and Richard agree that it's the smaller number, and it's documented, and Lay and Bazant don't provide any support for their estimate of the upper mass, and they almost double the weight of the upper mass in order to crush through the lower stories without observably slowing down.
All right. So, Ted, I addressed this in the beginning here a little bit, but why this is so important, why we keep on pushing with this. I know you wanted to make a point and you got some visual aids here, so I'm just going to give you the floor. Talk about why we keep on pursuing this particular issue with this paper and refuting Bazant.
Yeah. So as I said in the beginning, as you mentioned, NIST is their analysis only goes up to the point of collapse initiation, and they really relied on Bazant's analysis to explain why there was a complete collapse. And they even used this language in their report. And I think let's bring attention to this tweet that, sorry, my daughter has just entered the room and she's in the background. Sorry. It's okay. So, I want to bring up this quote by Mick West, who's one of our detractors. He's sort of he's one of probably the most famous debunker. I call him the Pope of demolition denial. Can we bring up that tweet from Mick West?
Sure.
Okay. Andy, I'll let you read it. I'll let you read his tweet.
All right, so Mick West is opening his mouth on Twitter, and he says, in one of the longest-running misunderstandings in AE 9/11 Truth's misunderstanding-laden history, they again claim that Bazant's 9/11 paper is foundational to the official 9/11 story. It's not, as a read of the official report will tell you. So Mick West is laying it on there.
Yeah, so I know it's bizarre. I don't even know why Mick West is trying to say that Bazant's analysis is not foundational to the official story. It clearly is, as I'm going to show you in the next couple of minutes. But I can't even understand why. I guess he's trying to say that we're on some wild goose chase, not really, coming up with things to focus on that are not worth focusing on. I don't know. But it's interesting when you actually read. Let's go to the next thing and just see the parts of the NIST report that he highlighted. If you go to the next slide. So this is what he highlighted in his tweet. This is from the NIST report. He highlighted a simplified approximate analysis. He highlighted the fact that Bazant's analysis, and this is Bazant's 2002 paper, did not address the details of impact damage, fire dynamics, and structural response of the towers. Well, no, it was just focused on the question of if the top begins to fall, from a structural mechanics perspective, why does the top then continue to crush through all the structure below it? That's what Bazant's paper was trying to figure out. And NIST says this. If you will go to the next slide, we'll show you the same NIST report, but we're going to highlight the important parts of that. First of all, Bazant's analysis addressed the question of why a total collapse occurred. That's a pretty important question, I think, right? Why on earth, if the top began to lose support, did it crush through the 90 stories of structure below that? I think everybody that was in those lower stories and that was on the ground on 9/11 would like to know why there was a total collapse. Later in this section, NIST says that they agree with the assessment. Essentially, they agree with Bazant's assessment of the tower's required structural capacity to absorb the released energy of the upper building section as it began to fall. So NIST is saying they agree with Bazant's analysis, right? If you go on to the next slide, we can show, as we've already alluded to, that NIST itself, first of all, this is the official story. NIST says it right here. The potential energy released by the downward movement of a large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that through energy of deformation. Since the stories below the level of collapse initiation provided little resistance to the tremendous energy released by the falling building mass, the building section above came down essentially in free fall as seen in videos. So that's in the NIST report. Now, it's interesting to note that this is what NIST calls events following collapse initiation. It's a half page from its 10,000 page report in which they talk about quote unquote events after collapse initiation, i.e. the actual collapse itself. They don't actually study the actual collapse itself. And they say that, if you go to the next slide, they say that in a footnote. This is a footnote on page 82 of their report. I'm just going to paraphrase it. The probable collapse sequence does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for collapse initiation were reached and collapse became inevitable. So NIST does not study the actual collapse. Bazant tries to study the actual collapse, or purports to study the actual collapse, explain why the tops of the towers were able to crush through the 60 and 90 stories of structure below them. And if we then move on to Bazant's paper in 2011, he actually says this. And can you remove the title, Andy? Are you able to remove that? It's actually blocking.
Oh, you mean, I see. Hold on one second here. Banners. Well, I will work on doing that.
Okay.
Right, there we go.
There we go. So this is the first sentence of Bazant's paper in 2011 that Tony and Richard are refuting in their discussion. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers has been explained as a gravity-driven process triggered by the collapse of a critical story heated by fire. And in parentheses, he cites Bazant and Zhu 2002. That's his paper that we are talking about. So he doesn't even cite the NIST. Now, he could cite the NIST report, but he also cites Bazant and Zhu 2002, his paper that he submitted 2 days after 9/11. This is the official story of how the towers came down. Like, there's no nuance here. It's very simple. NIST did not explain how the towers came down, how the tops of the towers crushed the 90 stories below. They say that they agree with Bazant's analysis, and Bazant is the one in the structural mechanics field, in the engineering community, whose analysis is understood to explain how the Twin Towers came down. So it's bizarre that McWest would say that Bazant's analysis is not foundational to the official story. It is the official story. And that is why we are putting so much effort into trying to get Tony and Richard's paper published as it should be, because it refutes Bazant's analysis and it refutes the official story unequivocally.
Well, there you go. It is bizarre, but debunkers do what they do, and it is ridiculous, but that's what they are reduced to, and you can't blame dogs for barking. So what's the next thing to watch? What's the next step in this whole process that our supporters can follow to know, where we're at with this entire process?
Well, basically, we're somebody at the Journal of Engineering Mechanics is going to review the paper and Tony and Richard's rebuttal of the reviewer's comments from 2012. It could be Ulm, or maybe he could decide to reassign it to an associate editor at the Journal. We should know that within 2 weeks if he's going to be undertaking the review, the review of their appeal, or if it's going to be somebody else. I would expect, we should have a decision on their appeal within a month. And if it's a positive decision, you could expect their paper to be published, say, within the next 3 months. Bazant and Lay, his co-author, will have something like a month to write a closure, or what's called a closure. It's basically a response to Tony and Richard's discussion paper. So it could go on longer if we continue to get the same kind of stonewalling, the same kind of ridiculous resistance from folks at the Journal and from folks at ASCE. The worst case scenario would, which would be unfortunate, is that we have to actually continue with our ethics complaint because it's clear that we're not getting a good faith, fair review from the editor or associate editors at the Journal of Engineering Mechanics. And if we're not getting a good faith review there, we will push to resume our ethics complaint and actually have a disciplinary hearing, where we bring our accusations against the original editors from 2013, Dr. Ballerini and Dr. Willem. So, but I hope within like 2 to 3 months, like within a month, we will be telling people this paper is going to be published. Stay tuned. That's, I continue to be optimistic because I know that we're right. So
You're absolutely right. And history will show that. So it's best to get on the right side of it now, because I really think that the tide is turning in this entire country, in this entire world. And at some point, the truth will be acknowledged. And the people who tried to stand against us will feel shame for that position and for those actions. So best to right the course now. That's my opinion. Take it or leave it. Ted, thank you so much for everything that you're doing to help out with this process. Give them hell. And if you're not signed up for our emails out there to keep track of stories like this, then do so. You can go to ae911truth.org, subscribe right there. But for my part, this is Andy Steele with Ted Walter saying we'll see you later. Bye-bye.